things do change in the world. You start down a plan, you think, actually, it was the wrong plan, I want to change my mind. It's reasonable that politicians sometimes want to change their minds and they get some more information. But this isn't what we're talking about here. We knew about the problems of the tax system years ago. We've known about, education issues. It's not like we couldn't have foreseen any of these things. It's just changes in policy. It's a lack of strategy about what are we doing, let's commit to it, let's make sure we've got the right idea up front.
Hello and welcome to another election special edition of the IFS Zooms In. I'm Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and today we're going to be talking about the Conservative manifesto, or at least the fiscal bits of that manifesto. They're promising quite a lot of things there. 17 billion a year of tax cuts, big hike in defence spending, which they claim is fully costed and paid for. So where is all that money coming from? Well, a big cut in the projected welfare bill, £12 billion off that. As with everybody else, they're suddenly going to find £5 or £6 billion cracking down on tax avoidance and evasion, and they're saving billions, they hope, from cutting civil service numbers, reducing spending on management consultants and, quote, quango efficiencies. So what do we make of all of those policies? Are they real? Are they grounded in evidence? Are they achievable? In this episode, we'll be looking at that manifesto, and to do that, I'm delighted to say, joined by my colleagues Carl Emerson, Christine Farquharson and Helen Miller. So let's start with the overall picture here. We've got a tax-cutting manifesto, some extra money for defence, and hope for big cuts in the welfare bill. Helen, does that feel to you like it adds up? Are these credible commitments on spending to go with their tax plans?
Well, I think on the tax side, we're quite certain about how much the tax cuts would cost. So I think we can, think of the 17 billion as definite. So I think there's not too much controversy around big picture, the size of the tax cut. I think, as you already mentioned in your intro, the issue is how they're going to pay for that. And obviously the concern is coming from the fact that they're trying to get a lot of this from the welfare bill. So my guess is they're going to find it harder to find the money to pay for these tax cuts.
Well, let's talk about the tax cuts and then go on to the savings. What taxes do they want to cut?
Well, the biggest thing they want to cut, that most people have heard about, is employee national insurance contributions. So they want to take another 2 percentage points off of that. So it was 12% not very long ago. It's already down to 8%, and they want to take it to 6%. And actually, for the self-employed, they'd like to entirely abolish the main rate of self-employed national insurance contributions. That would go from 6% down to 0%. So that's a pretty chunky increase. If you're an employee, got my numbers with me, if you're an employee on earning like £35,000, it's kind of average earnings, then just the NICS cut alone would make you about £450 a year better off. If you're self-employed, you're really quids in, you're going to get more like £1,350. But actually, we already know, and we've said many times in this podcast, that thresholds are being frozen across the next parliament. So actually, if you put those into it as well, just think of what's going to happen in future if they came to power, the NICS cuts alongside the threshold freezes. So actually, for the average employee, the tax cut would be more like £260. So still substantial, but less exciting when you think of the threshold freezes.
So those threshold freezes, just to be clear, we've already had a bunch of several years where income tax allowances and the thresholds have been frozen, and they're nailed in for another 3 years of freezes, aren't they? And that's something like an £11 billion tax rise.
Exactly. And no party said yet that they want to stop that. So that, we assume that the tax rise will go ahead. The Conservatives have said they would offset that for at least some people by having the NICS cut. So most people would overall see their tax, not everybody, not the lowest earners, not the highest earners, but people on sort of low to middle-ish earnings would see a tax cut overall with the NICS cut in place. I think one of the striking things about yesterday that I kind of can't help myself mention is that one of the effects of abolishing the main rate of self-employed NICS would be to, blow open again, make even bigger the difference between how we tax employment and self-employment. There's already a preferential treatment of self-employment that is hard to justify. They don't get low benefits to any significant degree. It's not a good way to incentivise risk-taking or entrepreneurship, and this would make the difference bigger. So we'd have a bigger incentive to be self-employed, even if it's not the most productive thing for you to do, and even if it's not the thing that makes you happiest, there would be a bigger tax incentive to do it. So one of the downsides of this package of measures is that because they've gone further with the self-employed tax cut, you'd have that big gap opening up.
There's already quite a big incentive. If I'm an employer, in many ways I'd rather contract with you, not you, Helen, with someone.
I'd love to be self-employed if that's the thing I can do. I mean, that would be a big saving.
As a self-employed contractor, because I, as an employer, don't have to pay any national insurance contributions on that. And the person who's working for me, under this plan, would also pay no national insurance contributions. So a big advantage there. And
just to make that a bit more concrete, just to put a number on the size of that gap, under these plans, if, as an employee, imagine I'm a basic rate employee, I'm in the basic rate band, my income would be subject to tax of 35% once you add up income tax and employee and employer national insurance contributions, compared to just 20% for the self-employed. So 20% for self-employed, 35% for employees. That's a really big tax wedge between those two legal forms. So a really big incentive to be self-employed if you can.
And this isn't just self-employed plumbers and electricians. There's also partners in law firms and accountancy firms who count as self-employed for these
Absolutely.
purposes.
Yeah. It's not everything from white van men up to people in the city.
So actually, it's interesting. I think I'm right in recalling, aren't I, that during the pandemic, when Rishi Sunak, as Chancellor then, introduced the furlough scheme, he introduced a scheme also for the self-employed. And if I recall, he said at that point that he wants to bring the self-employed tax system more in line with employees. And actually, Jeremy Hunt did a little bit when he reduced national insurance more for employees than for the self-employed. So this seems to be number 936 on the list of sort of this government's tax U-turns.
Yeah, so people like me have been, here at IFS, been saying for decades about the problem between giving preferential rates to self-employed. A few of us got a little bit excited and actually cast your mind back. Philip Hammond tried to narrow the gap. He had to U-turn because he couldn't get it through. And then, Sunak did say that when he was introducing this big measure for self-employed, effectively, if you're going to get equal benefits, you should pay equal taxes. And a lot of us were like, oh, great, this is a turning point. We can actually start to move towards something sensible. We got rid of Class 2 NICs. That was a little move in the right direction. There was a narrowing of the gap in the most recent set of cuts that we've already had. So a few of us were thinking, okay, at least there's something here that might be, in the right direction. And this has just blown all that wide open again. This is just back to the old rhetoric of we need to support risk takers and business owners. And, yes, you might want to do that. This is a horrible way of doing it. So, big swing back in the wrong direction.
Okay, well, I'm going to pull you off that.
Please do. I'll be here all morning.
I know is your favourite one. But there are some other tax changes here. We'd heard before about the fact that the Conservatives want to increase the tax-free allowance for pensioners, number 736 on their list of U-turns, given that they're the ones that abolished the higher tax-free allowance for pensioners. But the thing I think that really annoyed you, Helen, and possibly even more than what's happening for the self-employed, was this long list of promises not to do things. Just tell us.
So thank you for the invitation.
Tell us why. Tell us exactly how annoyed you were.
I wasn't very annoyed about the self-employed
why.
until I saw the laundry list of things that the Conservative Party are planning not to do. So I brought my list with me. So we already heard about tax locks on the big taxes. I mean, and they've said they're not going to increase the rates of income tax or VAT. Obviously, they're going to cut NICs if they got to power. So that's the big three taxes, ruling out. They also don't want to increase corporation tax, capital gains tax, stamp duty, or any tax on pensions. And not just that, they went to the effort of writing down a long list of specific silly reliefs. They also don't want to scrap, for example, reliefs within capital gains tax and inheritance tax. Actually, quite a lot of effort went into planning all these little reliefs you're not going to scrap. And as if that wasn't bad enough, now you've ruled out change to the vast majority of the tax system. They've picked two issues that are in urgent need of reform. So council tax, which is 33 years out of date already, it's going to be unsustainable at some point. Most people are in the wrong council tax band. We can't keep that. But 100 years is going to be silly. At some point it has to change. They said, nope, we're not doing that. And motoring tax, well, they've actually said, we want to replace fuel duties. We know we've got a problem here. We want to do something. And they've now said, but we're not going to do per mile road charging. So what are you going to do? So they've ruled out almost anything. I take this as, manifestos should be setting out visions. I didn't expect to see the tax policy for the next 5 budgets laid out. But I was looking for what's the vision. I think the vision here is quite clear. They've looked at the tax system and thought, okay, we're pretty happy with that. It looks good to me. Let's leave it as it is. And personally, I think that's really dismal because I look at the tax system and think, wow, what a mess, how much better we could do. Whether you wanted to be, higher or lower taxes overall, we could do better. So perhaps we shouldn't be surprised. We put a report out this week looking back at the last 14 years and saying that we thought there was at least I think there'd been lots of missed opportunities on tax reform. And this feels a bit like they're promising more of the same. So made me even more upset than self-employed NIC's differences.
So we had a very upset Helen yesterday. And of course, partly what this is about is trying to trap the Labour Party. I mean, let's not get too much into the politics here, but the more the Conservatives rule out, the more they challenge Labour to rule things out, and the more we end up, whoever wins, with a tax system which is frozen in aspic in a way which is, as we have discussed on this podcast a number of times before, really very bad indeed in terms of its effects and its structure and so on. And if, as we at least expect, the tax take remains at its highest level as it has been in the last 70 years and possibly goes even higher, getting that structure right is ever more important. And the last thing we want to do is have politicians say, let's keep all of the nonsense that we've got at the moment.
Just to say to anyone, to anyone on the Labour Party's listening, or to any media people who are listening, I mean, I think the Labour Party should absolutely not fall for that trap. I mean, it is absolutely political. No voters, I think, should be reasonably expecting a party who wants to seriously govern for the next, 5-10 years to be ruling out reform to huge swathes of the tax system. That's not a sensible thing to be doing. And I don't think we want to get into a bidding war about who's willing to rule out, the most ideas. That's not a good place for anyone to be. Again, and it doesn't matter whether you want taxes higher or lower. It's not a point about how big the tax system is. It's a point about the design of the tax system and how you're collecting taxes. So I sort of hope what we don't see is lots of interviews where we say, Rachel Reeves, are you going to do this? Are you going to do this? And keep trying to get. I think it's just not it's a silly game to be trying to play. Although you're obviously right, Paul. It's a political game, and I'd be assassinated as a politician. So.
Metaphorically, I hope.
Yeah.
None of us are standing for election. I think I can exclusively reveal in this podcast. Carl, as another person not standing for election, the big revenue raiser or intended revenue raiser in the Conservative manifesto was an intended 12 billion off the projected welfare bill. Now, perhaps it's worth just explaining first up that isn't 12 billion off the current welfare bill. This is 12 billion off the expected level of the welfare bill a few years hence. And that's really important. It both makes it more plausible than it might sound, but it's also important to understand why the Conservatives might be putting it in that frame.
Yeah, and the big picture context here is that one of the huge challenges that we face as a country is around the public finances, the question of why are we struggling to fund public services yet have high taxes. And one of the answers to that is the increasing amounts that's being spent on working age benefits, and in particular working age benefits that are going to people with health conditions. That's grown dramatically since 2019. So to give you some numbers on that, back in 2019, 3.2 million working age individuals receiving a benefit and having a health-related condition. That's gone up by 1 million already, so it's now at 4.2 million, and it's forecast to keep rising to 5.4 million in 28-29. So it's been growing really fast. It's not slowing down, and the official forecasts think it's going to continue growing. And that means the amounts that the government will be spending on these benefits is growing hugely. So I think it's quite right that anyone serious about wanting to be in power after the election takes a serious look at this spending, make sure that we're happy with who it's going to and the amounts they're getting, make sure that we're providing the right support and that the taxpayer is getting good value for money. So I think that's all understandable. What the Conservatives want to do is essentially try and limit the growth in that spending over the next few years so that by the time we get to the fifth year of the next Parliament, they would be spending £12 billion a year less than what the current forecast implies. So in some sense, that looks pretty achievable. That would essentially mean spending roughly what we're currently spending on those benefits, stopping the growth from continuing going forwards, and still be spending a lot more than what we were spending pre-pandemic.
Just give those numbers again very quickly, Carl, because they're very striking. So how many people did we have on these benefits in 2019, and how many are we expected to have by 2028?
So 3.2 million people working age in the UK receiving a benefit who's deemed to have a health-related condition. Because it's been growing very sharply and that's not showing any signs of slowing up, that's set to reach 5.4 million in 28-29. I mean, to put it another way, before the pandemic, every month about 20,000 people flowed onto a disability benefit. That figure's now at around 40,000 each month.
I mean, that is an astonishing change in the overall level, an astonishing change in the rate at which people flowing on. So as you say, it's not surprising that people, whoever's in office, should be looking at this. And I've absolutely no doubt that a Labour government in office will be looking at this. Do we know anything about what the Conservatives are saying they would actually do in order to achieve this slowdown, essentially in order to stop this growth?
The Conservatives point to a number of measures that they would take. Now, some of those measures, many of those measures are actually things that are already existing government policy, that were already due to come into effect in the next Parliament, that were already incorporated in the forecast. So there's nothing wrong with reminding people who are committed to that. There's nothing wrong with putting that in your manifesto. It might even make it easier to legislate that in the next Parliament. But what it doesn't do is change the forecast for spending at the end of the Parliament, because it's already appropriately in those forecasts. There's one particular measure which is not already in the forecast. The government had already announced it as something of its intent, and that was to look at the extent to which people moving on to disability benefits. These are benefits that are designed to give money to people because their health condition imposes additional financial costs on their day-to-day living, is to look at that and to see whether some people, potentially some people with mental health conditions, really have what the government considers to be additional costs in their life. So I think the question the government is raising, or the Conservative Party is raising, is, for example, some people with anxiety, do they have additional costs as a result of that anxiety? It's not questioning that they have a disability, it's whether they're deemed to have additional costs associated with them. The Conservative Party is saying they want to basically give fewer people this disability benefit, personal independence payments. Now, clearly, there are arguments for and against that kind of reform. I think the challenge is that when you do that kind of reform, it takes time to deliver the kind of savings you might hope for. Often what you do is you say that the new health test will apply to new claims, or when people come up for their mandatory reassessments, you don't tend to say we're going to reassess everybody who's already receiving the benefit. Often it takes time to trial the new test out to get it right. So it takes years and years before any changes have a full effect. And I think it's also worth noting that the government's previously tried to make savings in this area and failed. So, for example, after the 2010 general election, when personal independence payments were introduced, the then coalition government said, we will reduce the number of people claiming these benefits by 20%, and we will reduce the amount spent on these benefits by 20%. In 2019, the OBR did a review, and it concluded that that reform probably increased the cost of the system. So that's a reform deliberately aimed at reducing costs, and the OBR at least thinks it added to costs. So reforms in this area are very difficult to do. And I think actually to get the £12 billion that the Conservatives want, they'd probably have to announce some more measures after the election.
So a tough ask. I don't think what we're saying here is that efforts here should not be made. There's clearly a political decision to be made about how tough you want to be on working age welfare. There's clearly an issue about the remarkable growth in the number of people here. And there's actually not a brilliant understanding about exactly why there's been this growth. There may have been, it looks like there's been some worsening in population health post-pandemic, but there's also some suggestions that this is partly driven by the cost of living crisis and the fact that there's a bigger incentive, as it were, to try and claim these benefits, partly because other benefits have been held down so low. And as you say, Carl, making changes in the past has always proved challenging. But certainly the £12 billion is an aspirational number in terms of savings, whereas, as Helen was saying, the money that the tax cuts would cost is pretty certain. Let's move on to other aspects of the spending. Now, Christine, the big spending commitment was defence. The thing that's striking about defence spending is that if it really does go up from 2 to 2.5% of national income by 5 or 6 billion a year over the coming Parliament, that'll essentially be the first time that's happened in about 60 years.
That's right. And we've seen this really long-term squeeze on defence spending, and we've recycled a lot of the money that's freed up into other areas of public services. That's what's let us put up health spending year after year after year without necessarily seeing the size of the state grow by as much as it otherwise would have had to do. So if we're now in a world where we're saying we want more spending on health and we want more spending on defence, that's inevitably going to put more pressure on all of the other areas of public services, particularly if we're putting a ceiling on how much we can raise in tax or how much borrowing we want to do.
And a number of people, I mean, I've been asked a number of times, what on earth is going on here? We've got taxes at their highest level ever. We've got public services which are visibly struggling. How can all of that be? And part of the answer is, well, for the first time in decades, we're increasing, not cutting, defence spending. As Carl has said, we've got big increases in working age welfare spending, and on top of that, we've got big increases in what we're spending on debt interest. So this is part of the story. Now there's another 5 or 6 billion on defence spending, and how the Conservatives say they're going to pay. Again, that's a definite increase. Where's that being paid?
So we always play this sort of notional game with manifestos where we very directly say, here's our spending commitment and here's exactly what we're going to do to raise the revenue or cut spending elsewhere to pay for that. And I think in the Conservative scorecard, they said this defence spending was going to be paid for by cutting civil service numbers and redirecting some of the R&D budget into defence. Now, redirecting R&D, you can imagine that there's R&D that you could usefully do in defence, and so that's more of a shifting things around. Cutting civil service headcount, the Conservative Party have said they want to see the civil service go back to the size it was before the pandemic. So that's about 75,000 fewer jobs. That's how many civil servants we've added since March 2019.
That's a lot of extra jobs, which presumably were brought in to deal with the pandemic and have never got away.
It is a lot of extra jobs. I mean, I think the question here is we've seen a lot of promises around efficiency, right? So we're going to have fewer civil servants. We're going to have fewer NHS managers. We're going to have halve the amount of spending on consulting that government does. And we're going to have these quango efficiencies. And I don't think anybody really quite knows what that means. But to the extent that these quangos and managers and consultants and civil servants, to the extent that they're actually delivering something useful, getting rid of them is only going to add to the pressure on public services and only going to make it harder to actually improve what the state is trying to do.
And also it's going to make balancing the books harder still, because if you were thinking, so if you look at the sort of budget numbers and the thing we've gone on about, ad nauseam to some extent, which is that the budget numbers suggest cuts across public service spending post-election. If you're using those efficiency cut savings, if you think those efficiency savings to pay for defence, that makes it even more difficult to cut spending to fit the budget envelope that the government has set itself.
That's right. And, I think one place where we really see this actually is in schools. So Helen talked about the Conservative Party looking at the tax system and saying, look, we're happy, no changes here. On schools, actually something a little bit different happened. So the manifesto committed that they would protect per pupil spending in real terms through the rest of the parliament. Obviously, that's a floor, not a ceiling, so they could still deliver more than that. But we're in a world where pupil numbers are going to fall by about 400,000 over that period. And so actually, per pupil protection on the school's budget means something like potentially a £3.5 billion real terms cut in total school spending. Now, that is not an impossible thing to do, but it's very difficult to see how you do that without cutting back on your school's workforce or indeed closing schools altogether. And those were redundancies or vacancies or workforce reductions that weren't mentioned in the ones that we've talked about so far. So there are going to be these other pressures. And I think that will be the kind of story when you're trying to make those big savings and big efficiencies, and you're already taking some of those efficiencies, banking them and putting them into defence.
Yeah, and that's, I was going to come on to this schools point. It's a really important issue. I mean, it's a remarkably unambitious commitment, in a sense, as you say, to maintain per pupil funding in a world where the number of pupils are falling. And you might, as you say, take that. It's not a promise of a £3 billion cut, but it's certainly giving themselves space for a £3 billion cut. And actually, look, we should take advantage of demographic change when it helps. And if there are fewer kids, you might expect to be spending less on educating those kids. But just think, what makes that difficult? I mean, in a sense, you would hope that we'd be able to get some fiscal benefit from having fewer kids, even if in the long run it means there's not going to be anyone working to look after me in my old age. But let's park that issue. And why can't we just expect to be able to save that $3 billion relatively straightforwardly?
So, you said taking advantage of demographic change. I think when we're looking at public services, there's basically two approaches you can take to that. Number one is what this manifesto gives itself the space to do, which is you take that demographic change, you say, that's great. We're going to bank that, we're going to take that money, we're going to put it somewhere else. Number two is you take that demographic change and you say, well, actually, that lets us do something to improve the quality of public services. So if we end up in 2029 with per pupil spending at the same real terms level it is now, that also means that per pupil spending is going to be at the same real terms level it was back in 2010. That's 2 decades almost with no real terms growth in per pupil spending. That is pretty extraordinary, particularly given the amount of new responsibilities that schools are picking up over that period. But even if you try and go down the first route, even if you say we're going to take that $3.5 billion and we're going to do something else with it, you have to think about what the plan for actually extracting that money out of the system looks like. So if you're going to take advantage of demographic change, you're looking at how are we going to get more pupils into a smaller number of classrooms? Which teachers are we going to not replace when they leave the profession, for example? Potentially, which schools are we going to close? Which year groups are we going to merge? Which classes are we going to allow to become bigger because we now have fewer teachers to try and teach those kids? So none of those things is impossible in and of itself, but all of them are hard, and all of them are probably going to take a little bit of time to deliver, particularly in the school system, since we're now in the world where the government actually has fewer levers to pull because there's this long-run trend of giving schools much more freedom and moving into an academy system.
And you can imagine the local problems created when local schools have to shut down under those circumstances. I mean, on the upside, as you've said, lots of teachers leave the profession every year, partly because their pay has dropped like a stone over the last 15 years. So in a sense, it wouldn't be too hard to deal with the fact that you'd need teacher turnover because we have lots and lots of teacher turnover. They're not necessarily always in the right places. But one of the reasons that per pupil spending hasn't gone up is that per teacher pay has fallen by, I can't remember, 15%, is it, since 2010?
So in real terms, teachers are paid the same now as they were back in 2001. So almost 25 years of no real terms pay growth.
And the rest of the population has seen from
something like
memory
18%.
So average pay up 18%, teacher pay up 0.
Yeah.
That's quite a big drop down the pay distribution.
Shockingly, we're really struggling to recruit teachers and retain good teachers at the moment.
I cannot begin to imagine why. There are other education policies in there as well, though, which are also quite interesting.
Yeah, actually bursting at the seams on education policies.
Excellent. Well, tell us all about them.
So, Helen made this point. Okay, we're gonna leave the tax system exactly as it is. I think the Conservative Party looked at the young people's landscape, young people policy, further education, and went down exactly the other route. So we had 4 big policies on young people, most of which we knew about before. We've got national service for 18-year-olds. We've got 100,000 new apprenticeships. We've got scrapping a bunch of university courses. And we've got a recommitment to what's called the Advanced British Standard, which is this idea we're going to have an international baccalaureate-style curriculum, which is going to replace A-levels and T-levels. Any of those things, any one of those things would be a really big reform in its own right. Trying to do all 4 of them at the same time is adding an awful lot of instability into a system. And that Advanced British Standard, to take one example, let's say we get rid of A-levels, let's say we get rid of T-levels. T-levels were introduced 4 years ago. They've not even been fully rolled out yet, so we're already going to talk about scrapping them. That would be at least the 8th major reform to the vocational education system since 2010.
Oh, God, that makes me want to get really angry.
And we're I think anger is maybe the theme of this podcast, because we're in a world where politicians, quite rightly, are talking a lot about parity of esteem. They say what we really want to do, and I think both Labour and the Conservatives have signed up to this, what we really want to do is make sure that young people who go down a vocational education route have the same opportunities and that their qualifications and skills are valued the same in the labour market as people who choose a more academic route, because those are different options, but they should be held in similar esteem. That's great, but you need employers to really be on board with that. And if you're going to try and get an employer on board with this vocational qualification is valuable, I understand it, I want to pay more for it, I want to recruit workers who have that qualification, you do actually need employers to know what the qualification is. And if you're changing them on average every 2 years, that becomes very difficult, and it becomes almost impossible for the labour market to be able to take on board the information and just learn what these qualifications are, what they stand for, and why they should want the workers who have them.
Yeah, and it's so frustrating because on one level, if you stopped, if you ignored history, the suggested changes you think might make some sort of sense. I mean, a British baccalaureate or whatever it's called, a broader education from age 16, all of those things make sense. But when you tear up particularly the vocational system every couple of years. And this government put in place T-levels, as you say, they're not even fully rolled out. And it's actually Rishi Sunak in the Conservative Party conference announced their abolition. You just kind of throw out your hands and just kind of want to give up. It's like we were talking about on taxes. It's this government that has changed tack more than half a dozen times on different taxes. And all of these things require some kind of stability, which we are sadly lacking, whether we get new governments or not. We often think about, if you move from one government to the next, one party to the next, you get instability in policy. We've had plenty of that without changing parties.
The thing here seems to be that the problem is a kind of a lack of strategy, right? Because it's like things do change in the world. Some might reasonably, you start down a plan, you think, actually, it was the wrong plan, I want to change my mind. It's reasonable that politicians sometimes want to change their minds and they get some more information. But this isn't what we're talking about here. We knew about the problems of the tax system years ago. We've known about education issues. It's not like we couldn't have foreseen any of these things. It's just changes in policy. And it sounds like on education, it's coming from the same. It's a lack of strategy about what are we doing, let's commit to it, let's make sure we've got the right idea up front.
Well, there's a lack of strategy even within the policies for young people that have been announced. So you're going to roll out this advanced British standard that's going to be for all 16 to 18-year-olds because we're scrapping T-levels and A-levels for this thing. At the same time, you're going to do this national service policy for all 18-year-olds, and you're going to wonder and worry about how you're going to pay for that and where those people are going to go and what's the commitment device and are you going to find their parents if they don't do it, and all of the other debates that we had at the start of this campaign. Why would you not bring those two things together, think about them together and think about, well, actually, if we want our 18-year-olds doing this advanced British standard and we want them doing this community service or whatever, maybe we can just make that an element of the curriculum rather than going down these two paths completely in isolation and probably changing our minds again in 18 months.
Carl, should we finish off just by asking you whether you saw anything in the manifesto that gave us a clue as to what the next spending review might look like under a Conservative government? We're in this world where, as we have said, we've got 1% a year increases in public service spending over the next 5 years. That's what the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, promised us. We've said a number of times that given what we know will happen to defence and health, childcare, that will mean cuts elsewhere. Was there anything in the manifesto which told us either they were going to find a way to avoid those cuts or where those cuts would come from?
I think it's slightly complicated. We were saying before the election campaign that the plan set out in March involved cuts to unprotected public services, maybe 10 to 20 billion pounds a year by the end of the Parliament. And we really wanted the major parties to try and address that and tell us where they would cut, or if they weren't going to cut, how they would find the money from somewhere else. The Conservatives didn't spell out in full anything like detail what the next spending review would look like. We didn't get that kind of detail from them. We didn't get it from the Liberal Democrats. I think it's fair to say we're not expecting it from Labour in their manifesto, although we're happy to be pleasantly surprised on that. Now, by committing to protect day-to-day spending on schools per pupil, of course, that opens up the possibility, as you were just discussing, of cutting the school's budget overall in real terms. If that happened, that would allow you to spend a bit more on unprotected public services. But of course, that's only a lower bound on what they might do on schools. They may still end up freezing the school's budget, not least because actually getting some of the cash out could be pretty difficult. And then if you look at other sources of savings, well, the Conservatives claim to have identified some savings, like things like cutting down civil service numbers, getting rid of some quangos, etc. But actually that money's been, if it can be found, has been spent on the defence budget. So that money's not available to be, for example, spending on further education or courts or prisons or local government services. So to some extent there, they've kind of reduced the areas you could look for if you were trying to cut money from unprotected services.
So I think, broadly speaking, no, we didn't get that answer. But then I think, as you say, to be fair, to the Conservatives, we haven't had that from anyone else, and we're not expecting it from Labour. I mean, the other thing we haven't talked about, and let's not do that now because this is also shared by all of the main parties, is a presumption that there's 5 or 6 billion of money just sitting on the table waiting to be picked up by HMRC when they get round to cracking down on tax avoidance and evasion. And we saw that in the Liberal Democrat manifesto, we saw it in the Conservative manifesto, and we know that we're going to see it in the Labour manifesto as well. Another, cracking down on avoidance evasion, a good thing. Are we sure we can get 5 or 6 billion? No, we're not. I mean, let's hope that we can. I think we probably ought to draw this to an end. It was fascinating looking through the Conservative manifesto and their promises on Tuesday. We will be doing the same to the Labour manifesto on Thursday this week, and we will bring you another edition of the election special. The IFS zooms in, looking at the Labour manifesto and whether what they promise adds up, and indeed what it is that they are promising. So thank you, everyone, for listening to this special episode of the IFS Zooms In. Thank you once again to my fantastic colleagues, Helen Miller, Christine Farquharson, and Carl Emerson. To see more of our work, please do visit www.ifs.org.uk. And to further support us, do consider please becoming a member for as little as £10 a month. You can find out more in the episode description. We will see you next time.